The London Underground has a lot to thank the Americans for with helping getting their system off the ground. And now that that system was amalgamated and one unit, the American connection was still very much present. This was in the form of William Graf Baker. Although William was born in the UK, his parents were American, and he spent many formative years studying abroad. He joined the Metropolitan Railway as a fitter, and in just 4 short years he had been promoted to the head of lifts and escalators, and by 1934 he was the chief mechanical engineer, overseeing all operations from the top of the station to the rolling stock many metres below. William had a simple philosophy. Will it work? Is the design simple? Can it be maintained easily? Can it be manufactured easily? And will it work well? In June 1935, a new modernisation plan was announced in conjunction with the LNER and the GWR. The Central Line and Northern Line were planned to be expanded westwards to Ruislip and Denham, and eastwards to join the LNER route at Epping, with all parts electrified for underground operations. Other works were planned but never completed due to the war. The government provided most of the capital through guarantees rather than using public funds, and for a time things were glorious under Lord Ashfield, Frank Pick's and William's care. Along with the new lines came new stock. These trains had new streamlined fronts. The engines were housed under the floor rather than behind the driver, giving a much more quieter ride and freeing up more space for passengers. The new traction motors applied to each bogie would allow more power to be transferred for allowing for smoother and faster acceleration. The 1930s, gripped by the new Art Deco, was gripped with streamlining fever. This also applied to the underground trains. It was considered the utmost in modern design, with perfectly rounded front and sweeping curves. The details continued into the cab. The cab was situated centrally in the train, giving the driver a better view of their surroundings, and passengers were treated to an Art Deco interior complete with sloping roofs and feather-shaped inlet grilles. For the first time, the engines had a simple form of air conditioning, which allowed the carriage to act as a sealed unit. The new trains were not without their hazards. The streamlined fronts made it very difficult to couple multiple units together safely, with large gaps in between each locomotive, and while it was thought it was a waste of time, streamlining the trains as they were nowhere near as fast as their steam engines that roared in the sunlight, the draw of the streamlining drew in the masses, and for the railway, the new trains were a PR masterpiece. But Frank Pick hated the styling and openly criticised the streamlining, stating that they were not fit for purpose. The 6 streamlined trains were eclipsed, though, by a large order of 1,121 vehicles. These new trains were virtually identical, but were in a cerulean blue and carried flat-ended fronts. The 1938 stock were the most successful stock on the whole underground network. The train saw 50 years of dedicated service and were warm and welcoming to the passengers, the last one being retired in 2021 on the Isle of Wight line. Other variants existed of the 1938 stock, which included the O trains, which were similar but had a flared trim at the bottom, shortening the gap between the train and the platform. 573 vehicles were ordered, as well as P and Q stock, which had traverse seating that aligned with the windows, with Frank Pick himself picking the seating design. While Frank was picking out the seating designs, however, he had another thing on his mind. The government had been preparing for war for some time, and when it appeared that war was inevitable, they contacted Frank Pick and appointed him to plan and implement civilian evacuations should the worst arise. In September 1939, the announcement came, and Frank's plan had to be actioned. Before the first troops hit foreign soil, the London Underground was moving at breakneck speed, ferrying passengers to Waterloo for the Steam Brothers to take them to the safety of the countryside. In just 2 days, over 600,000 people had been successfully and safely evacuated. Work on the various extensions were put on hold and some abandoned altogether. Priority was protecting the lines and to safeguard the network's safety. New floodgates and watertight doors were erected in stations at severe risk of flooding should the pumps fail or worse, a tunnel breach caused by a wayward bomb. Subway entrances, not important, were sealed with ballast to protect the tunnels underneath against bomb blasts, and disused stations were converted into military bunkers, railway operation rooms, and even Winston Churchill's war room, which is still in its warlike state today. On the 7th of September 1940, the Germans rained their first bombs on the London districts. The populace that had remained quickly realised that the underground was a perfect haven from the terror above. The deep tunnels protected thousands of people every night as they slept. The official powers did not generally recommend using the underground as a shelter. It had no amenities, and there was a real risk of people getting hurt or ill, and Frank Pick was quite opposed to people sleeping on the platforms or across dangerous lines at night. He stated it would represent a total failure of planning by every responsible authority, and tried to stop the masses by prohibiting the use of stations as shelters. But mayhem and panic ruled, and no one enforced the rulings. In a few weeks of the Blitz, over 175,000 people were sleeping on stations. Seeing that the notices were of no use, Frank had to act quickly to prevent people from being killed, and seeing that the people had won, Mr. J.P. Thomas was brought out of retirement to get some form of order to the crowded stations. Thomas implemented several changes to make the civilians more comfortable and safe. He brought in a ticket system. The ticket system was essential. Not only would it give him an accurate number of people within the station, but it stopped a group called the Droppers, who had gained access to the station before 6:30 p.m, the official time to let people sheltering in. The Droppers would reserve the best and safest areas on the platform by putting their belongings there and charging huge fees to the desperate to pay. Chemical toilets were installed, removing the filthy and unhygienic buckets. Bunk beds and even medical facilities were readily available, and the trains got in under support too. 6 special refreshment trains ran every night, visiting every station with fresh food and drink every day. Over 7 tons of food were delivered nightly and brought a great change from the dreary rations. The refreshment trains were a great public relations coup, and Sir Frank Pick and J.P. Thomas were commended for their efforts. They and the government took full advantage, using photos of smiling, sheltering people for a morale propaganda boost. Safety was, however, never a certainty, and there were several breaches by the Germans. Nearly 200 people were killed in just the first 6 months of the Blitz in stations that took direct hits. Balham Underground Station was badly damaged when a bomb exploded at ground level. The explosion killed 64 sheltering civilians and 4 staff. Scores of people and staff were killed when their train took a direct hit at Sloane Station. It would be only chance that the River Westbourne didn't breach its pipe, as the river connected to the Serpentine boating lake. If the pipe was breached, the lake would have been emptied within minutes, flooding the tube and turning the district line into an electric, water-filled death trap, killing tens of thousands of people sheltering there. Bank Station was another unfortunate victim of the Blitz. The subterranean ticket hall was completely destroyed, killing 56 people sheltering there when a bomb exploded above them. The worst loss during the war was not actually caused by enemy fire. In fact, until the end of the war, it was not mentioned at all, and few knew it had happened until the public inquiry was announced. Bethnal Green Station laid in its unfinished state, an unfortunate delay due to the war. The populace above was going about their day when anti-aircraft rockets began to fire nearby in a local park. The populace, terrified, ran to the shelters in panic. One of the shelters was the unfinished station. The men and women streamed down the stairwell in their hundreds. The stairwell was dark, and in a panic, a mother carrying her child tripped on the stairs near the bottom in the darkness. The result was instantaneous. People fell all around her, causing the people above them to fall on top of them. As more and more people fell, the masses above, not knowing of the danger, added to the crush by pushing forward. Soon, over 300 people were entangled at the foot of the stairwell. Some managed to wriggle free, while others were dragged to safety. But 173 people, the majority of them women and children, were killed. The government followed wartime reporting restrictions and withheld information about the disaster, with the full truth only being released in January 1945. It was the largest civilian loss on the network. The inquiry found that the anti-aircraft guns were not firing at aircraft at all, nor was there any enemy around. The gun's activation was merely an exercise to test the guns. Its findings only caused further heartbreak for the families whose loved ones were lost. Despite the war, underground operations continued as normal. It had to abandon some extensions and even entire routes, and they had to be thrifty. Materials were scarce, so the underground had to either make do, repair, or reuse. One of their most extraordinary examples was car number 14233. It was actually a mix of two railway engines. Both engines, engine and trailer, were damaged during the Blitz, and by itself both were beyond repair. But the engineering team got to work, and they managed to make one engine. The new car was put to work and eventually was preserved at the Buckinghamshire Railway Society. The underground has had a multitude of uses, but few knew of the factory within the tube's length. 2 miles of unfinished lines lay between Leytonstone and Newbury Park, which had been part of the new extension, were converted into a factory for making aircraft components. They employed over 2,000 people both day and night, hauling aircraft gear and making parts to modify tanks. The underground gave birth to over 700 Halifax bombers and were instrumental in the Air Force offensive bombing raids in Europe. The war, though, had taken its toll on Frank Pick. He was suffering from ill health for many years, but he wouldn't let his health deter him from his duty. He approached Lord Ashfield, asking him to have a joint managing director position, but Lord Ashfield decided not to offer the role, nor was Pick's original role available, as it was abolished in favour of several heads of departments. Franks decided not to contest, and settled for early retirement in 1941 due to his ailing health. He continued his role in the government and briefly became a Minister for Information before returning to the Ministry of Transport. He provided and recommended improvements to all aspects of transport provisions around the country, including rivers and waterways. But as he travelled around the country, his aides were noticing he was getting weaker. His finite detail and obsessiveness had taken its toll, and in November 1942, Frank Pick passed away peacefully at his home. All who knew him would remember his acute attention to detail, from the neat green signature on every paper to his keen eye that would often complain if the ballast around the tracks was not expertly and neatly trimmed or a single stone be out of place. Many called for Frank Pick to be knighted, and several times he was offered the accolade, but Frank politely declined. His assistants would pick up the knighthood in recognition of their efforts. But if ever was a man more deserving, then Frank was that man. Piccadilly Circus holds a fitting memorial to Frank, which was unveiled to the world in 2016, and no one has ever exerted such an influence on the nation's capital before or since. On the next episode of our mini-series, we look at the post-war recovery efforts of the underground system as we head to the 1950s, and how privately owned motor cars created a new type of war with the railways, so don't forget to tune in next time. I know you won't want to miss it.